Um, Now, we're here this afternoon to talk about Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods Conference, and a new book about it, The Battle of Bretton Woods, written by Benn Steil. Um, you may ask why, nearly 70 years after that momentous gathering in a remote New Hampshire town, and more than 40 years since the gold standard it established was undone by President Nixon, why should anyone care about Bretton Woods anymore? Well, because it's still not infrequently looked back upon rather wistfully as a sort of Camelot moment in world financial history, the first time a global monetary system was designed and an international body set up to manage it. And a certain mythology has grown up about the creation back in 1944 of this new world economic order. As Ben notes in the introduction of his book, there have been serious calls in the decades since, serious calls from time to time for a new Bretton Woods. So it's important to look closely at just how Bretton Woods came to be, its successes and its flaws. Ben does just that. And as an expert in the world's financial systems, he's very well suited to the task. He studied economics at Wharton and Oxford, then directed the International Economics program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London for a time, before coming to the Council on Foreign Relations 14 years ago. At the Council, he's a senior fellow and director of international economics. He's also the founding editor of International Finance, a scholarly economics journal, as well as a co-founder and managing member of Efficient Frontiers, which is a markets consulting firm. His several previous books received critical acclaim, and he's written articles and spoken widely on international finance, securities trading, and financial market regulation. At the center of the story that Ben tells about Bretton Woods is the drama between two pivotal figures who dominated the discussions: Britain's John Maynard Keynes and America's Harry Dexter. And they really were opposites. Keynes, witty, eloquent, self-assured, a celebrity economist, and Dexter, a U.S. Treasury official, driven, short-tempered, bullying. Their rivalry enlivens the book and contrasts with the often simplistic portrayal of Bretton Woods as one of amiable collaboration. As one reviewer put it, Keynes and Dexter were as different from each other as afternoon tea and bourbon. And there's another remarkable twist to Dexter that Ben explores in the book, and I'm sure he'll be talking about in a minute. I won't give that away. A number of reviewers have commended The Battle of Bretton Woods for being an exhaustively researched and fascinating read. They also have noted how instructive and well-timed it is, given present-day concerns about the shaky condition of the world economy and worries about where things like quantitative easing and crazily fluctuating exchange rates are taking us. As one reviewer in Forbes magazine quipped, President Obama would be wise to take Ben's book to Martha's Vineyard this summer. Ben plans to speak for a little while, and then he'll leave time for questions. Because we do record these events so that we can post them on our site and create an archive of events, we do ask that if you have a question, you make it to that microphone or that microphone there, so that we can hear your question and it can get picked up on tape. And then afterwards, Ben would be delighted to stay and sign copies of his book, which are available at the cash registers up front. So if you haven't already, please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Benn Steil.
Thanks so much, Brad. It's really a pleasure and privilege to speak at this book lovers mecca, Politics and Prose. And thank you all for coming out on a gorgeous Sunday afternoon. Can you all hear me? Microphone working? Okay. I see. Okay. How's that? A little better? Okay, I'll do my best. So I appreciate you all coming out on this gorgeous Sunday afternoon to hear about Bretton Woods, which is not the story of abstruse economic ideas it's normally associated with. It's actually a fascinating geopolitical story with a great cast of leading characters, as I'm sure you'll see. A little bit of scene setting. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 is the most important international gathering since the Paris peace talks in 1919, a quarter century earlier. It takes place in July of 1944, only a few weeks after the D-Day landings at Normandy. So there's a real sense of sort of anxious optimism in the air among the over 700 delegates from 44 nations. And indeed, President Roosevelt wanted to use this gathering to send a message to the enemy Axis powers that it was the Americans and the Allies that had the compelling vision for the post-war world. He thought this might actually serve to bring the war to a conclusion earlier. The actual substance of the event, however, was not scripted by Roosevelt, who had little interest in international economics. He was focused on winning the war. It was scripted by the U.S. Treasury. Two people in particular, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who really didn't know very much about economics. He described himself as an apple farmer, a gentleman apple farmer, but an apple farmer nonetheless. But he was a very close personal friend of FDR's from Hyde Park in New York. So he had the president's ear, but he basically had nothing to whisper into it. The ideas all came from one man, with whom he formed a sort of symbiotic bond over 11 years from 1934 to 1946, Harry Dexter White. Truly one of the most remarkable political figures of the 20th century that nobody knows anything about. We're going to talk a little bit about him later. FDR's Treasury, Morgenthau and White in particular, are what you might call economic determinists. They had a very specific a story about how the war came about. They blamed the currency wars of the early 1930s, particularly after Britain left the gold exchange standard in 1931. In their rendering, this led to the trade wars that spread the Great Depression internationally and created the environment of misery and anger that paved the way for the European dictators like Hitler and Mussolini to launch their wars of aggression. So they very much saw the new International Monetary Fund and World Bank that they were going to create as Bretton Woods as being necessary political complements to the United Nations that would be created 1 year later at San Francisco. But this was not some sort of abstract internationalist ideal. I have to emphasize that hardcore American national interest was very much at stake, center focus here. Put Bretton Woods in a wider context in the 1940s. Countries that wanted to trade in the 1940s could do it in only one of three ways. They could barter, and many of them did. That's what they were reduced to. Or they could use gold or U.S. dollars. But the United States controlled 2/3 of the world's monetary gold stock at the time. So we're really talking about a dollar-starved world that is at Bretton Woods to find out what the United States is going to do about this. And Harry Dexter White in particular is quite determined to exploit this unique situation in American history to sort of remake the global balance of power after the war. And this is Harry Dexter White. I'm quoting him now at the conference, speaking to the American delegation before they go off into the negotiations, trying to get through to them how important this conference is and why the Americans hold all the cards. He says, "It is gold in Fort Knox." He says this is why the United States was, quote, in such a powerful position at this conference. It's why we dominate the financial world. If only England was in that position, it would be a very different story. It might seem quite remarkable in the current context, but the 1930s and 40s, people like Harry Dexter White saw Great Britain as being America's natural geopolitical rival in the world. And after the war would end, they saw Britain naturally as continuing to be America's great geopolitical rival. So this was an event in which the United States would sort of remake the script so Britain would no longer be a rival in the post-war world. What's fascinating about White, though, is that he's obsessed with Britain from quite an early time in his tenure at Treasury. I found a memorandum in his file dated 1936. This is 2 years after he arrives at the U.S. Treasury. He's barely more than a bureaucratic temp there. He's nobody important, in which he writes, the more sterling countries there are, countries that use the pound sterling or that are linked to the pound sterling, the stronger will be England's position around a conference table should an international conference take place. So nobody's talking about such an international conference, but he's already planning one in his mind, and at this conference he has determined that the United States will best Great Britain. So Bretton Woods is actually part of a larger geopolitical agenda hatched within FDR's Treasury to eliminate Great Britain as a political and economic rival in the post-war period. Henry Morgenthau, after FDR died, was explaining to President Truman what he had set out to do at Bretton Woods in 1944, and this is how he characterized it. He said, I wanted to, quote, move the financial center of the world from London and Wall Street to the United States Treasury. Note the and Wall Street part. This was very much an anti-banker agenda as well, which was critical to the New Deal. So this is the New Deal, as it were, writ global. At Bretton Woods, he tells the American delegates, Morgenthau, now the advantage is ours here, and I personally think we should take it, to which White adds, if the advantage was theirs, that is Britain, they would take it. Now, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously referred to American Lend-Lease aid during the war as, quote-unquote, the most unsorted act. I would emphasize that Lend-Lease actually came with very painful geopolitical terms attached to it. This was very much an act of self-interest. It was part of a Faustian bargain that Britain was forced to agree with the United States to get through a war. And these were the components of it. America would give Britain short-term financial assistance to get through the war in the form of Lend-Lease, and brief post-war transitional financial assistance, all in terms of loans, not in terms of grants. Some of you may realize some connections with the current Eurozone crisis, which Germany is determined to resolve only through loans and not through grants. In return for which, the British will agree to three things. First, to end so-called imperial trade preference. This is the arrangement by which Britain gave itself privileged access to the markets of its colonies and dominions. FDR's administration were fundamentally anti-colonialist. They viewed themselves as being representatives of the great anti-colonial power, the United States. Of course, American exporters were also very much against imperial trade preference because this limited the markets that they could export to. Second, Britain would once again make the pound sterling fully convertible into U.S. dollars at a fixed exchange rate. This was a mortal threat to British solvency. The deadline that was set was ultimately July 15th, 1947. For the British, a sort of day that will live in infamy. The day Britain literally went bankrupt, and that bankruptcy was scripted by the U.S. Treasury. And finally, Britain would accept the U.S. dollar as the basic unit of account for global trade after the war. This was the fundamental defining element of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And why did Britain agree to such a thing? Well, as a British delegate and a famous economist in his own right, Lionel Robbins, put it at Bretton Woods, and I quote, "We needed the cash." It was really that simple. And in fact, the collapse of British imperial power after the war, particularly in late 46 and early 47, when all the pillars of Britain's empire come crumbling down, Burma, Greece, Palestine, India, this was all driven by a lack of dollars. And this lack of dollars was specifically scripted by the U.S. Treasury. Seems, again, remarkable in today's context, but the United States during World War II was spontaneously more generous to China and the Soviet Union than they were with Great Britain, again, because we saw the British as being the natural political rival after the war. I would emphasize that this vision at Bretton Woods of the post-war world, which had three major elements. First, that the British Empire could be quickly and peaceably dismantled. 2, that Germany could be dismembered and deindustrialized, the so-called Morgenthau Plan, and 3, that the Soviets could be permanently co-opted into a peacetime alliance. These 3 pillars were entirely overthrown just 3 years later with the Marshall Plan. The central elements of the Marshall Plan were that Britain is no longer a geopolitical rival. It's a desperate ally that must be saved from imminent collapse and a potential communist takeover, that Germany needed to be rehabilitated and turned into the industrial engine of a new integrated Western Europe being very much an American conception, certainly not a European one, and finally that the Soviets could not be co-opted and in fact needed to be contained, in George Kennan's words. A little bit about the 2 main characters at Bretton Woods who are truly fascinating, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. These are 2 men who had a sort of grudging admiration for each other. In case of White, he really worshipped Keynes as a thinker. He was determined to best him, but he worshipped him as a thinker. He used to get himself literally physically sick in preparation for negotiations with Keynes because he didn't want to humiliate himself in front of his colleagues. Nobody wanted to debate Lord Keynes. This was a brutal experience. Keynes, for his part, did not think very much of White as a thinker, but he knew that he was enormously influential in terms of policymaking in FDR's administration. Here's what Keynes said about White shortly after meeting him for the first time in the early 1940s. He said, "He has not the faintest conception how to behave or observe the rules of civilized intercourse." These are 2 men from entirely different backgrounds, and they're very conscious of it. John Maynard Keynes is the son of upper middle class Cambridge academics. He was raised by a governess and servants. He was expected to go on to great things. Harry Dexter White was the youngest of 7 children born in Boston to Lithuanian Jewish immigrants in 1892. His father was a hardware peddler. He actually dropped out of college during his first attempt in order to go back into the family hardware business. These 2 people come from very different backgrounds, and they're very conscious of it. There's a lovely vignette about their negotiations in 1943. They've been sparring now for a year and a half on whose plan would win out, the Keynes plan or the White plan. Keynes gets fed up with White and his plans. He takes the White plan and hurls it to the floor and says, "This is intolerable. It is yet another Talmud." Keynes is very conscious of the fact that White is Jewish. His key deputies, Eddie Bernstein, Jewish. Henry Morgenthau himself was Jewish, and this would come out when he was frustrated. To which White responded, "We will try to produce something which your highness can understand." Keynes at Bretton Woods was not just the most famous economist of his age, indeed the 20th century, perhaps even of all time, but he was the first ever celebrity economist. Today we're used to celebrity economists, people like Paul Krugman and Nouriel Roubini who jet around the world with the media hanging on their every pronouncement. But at Bretton Woods, this was a brand new thing. The American media was there to hear what the great man thought. They didn't necessarily like it, and in many cases, the big national newspapers, and particularly the New York Times, thought that Bretton Woods was really just a British trick to steal American gold. But they had to hear what the great man thought. And the Americans bitterly resented it. In fact, Henry Morgenthau refused to let Keynes speak on the first day of the conference, even refused to let him nominate Morgenthau to be the president of the conference because he wanted to keep him away from the media. Harry Dexter White relegated Keynes to be head of the commission to create the World Bank at Bretton Woods because he, Harry Dexter White, would head the commission to create the International Monetary Fund where the dollar would be enthroned as the world's currency, and he was determined to keep Keynes far away from this. Keynes is extremely astute in terms of understanding what the Americans are up to in the years running up to Bretton Woods. He explains to the British government that the Americans may use Britain's impending bankruptcy as, quote unquote, an opportunity for picking out the eyes of the British Empire, to make Great Britain a, quote unquote, satellite of the United States, and to impose the American conception of the international economic system on the on the world. But he also explains to the British government, look, you want to engineer new post-war social and economic policies, but it will be impossible to do that without further American assistance. And he said, I'm quoting again, the Americans are strong enough to offer inducements to many or most of our friends to walk out on us. So he knows the situation. Despite this, Keynes may literally be the world's worst diplomat. He is, in every official trip to Washington in the course of his career, a supplicant. Every visit he ever made to Washington from World War II to World War I to World War II was a begging mission. But he never behaved as a supplicant. He was determined to best whoever he was in the room with in verbal sparring. His command of logic was superior. His command of the facts and rhetoric was superior. And he humiliated the Americans every time. But they had no reason to take it. Here's a nice little account of his first official trip to Washington, a begging mission in 1917 during World War I. The comments came back to London that the man was, and I quote, rude, dogmatic, and disobliging. Another set of comments, he was too offensive for words. Who spoke these words? The British ambassador and his financial secretary. The Americans actually said much worse about him. But I mean, the question ultimately has to be asked, since it was the White plan that made it through Bretton Woods, not the Keynes plan. Could anybody have done better than Keynes? And my answer is yes. There were options available to Britain. Britain did not have to accept American terms at Bretton Woods, and indeed there were some very prominent British civil servants who were scathing about Keynes. In particular, one senior British Treasury civil servant named Sir Richard Clarke, Otto Clarke, who said Keynes was overly wedded to the idea of a grand design, as he put it. We didn't need to borrow this money from the U.S. Treasury with all these geopolitical terms. We could have borrowed it privately. We could have borrowed from the Export-Import Bank in the United States, which didn't have these geopolitical constructs behind it. We could have borrowed more from the Canadians. And indeed, there was a rearguard action against the FDR administration in May of 1944, just before Bretton Woods. The British financial secretary in Washington met with a group of prominent New York bankers. In May of 1945, the bankers were very anti-New Deal, very much against the IMF, which would compete with its international lending business, and offered the British a deal. You walk away from this conference, and we will provide you with $3 billion, at least $3 billion of concessionary loans. Keynes turned it down flat. Why? Keynes was very obsessed with his legacy. He wanted to be known as the man who overthrew the gold standard and replaced it with a new managed international monetary system. He didn't like White's system, but he believed that system would eventually fall of its own accord. Indeed, just a few years ago in 2009, the Chinese central bank governor, Zhou, came out with a rather remarkable statement where he said that Bretton Woods may have been a terrible mistake. We never should have taken the White plan. We should have taken the Keynes plan for a new international currency that would have replaced the U.S. dollar. Keynes was just hoping that the world would come to this realization much sooner, but it didn't. Harry Dexter White. White is, in my view, one of the most fascinating American political figures of the 20th century that nobody knows anything about. As I said, he was the son of a hardware peddler. Went back to college at age 30 after deciding finally he was bored of the hardware business. And there he had a sort of epiphany of sorts. He told a friend that he had come to the conclusion that most governmental problems are fundamentally economic. Therefore, I decided to stick with economics. This is a man who's truly fascinated with politics and views economics as a means to an end. And he's very interested from his early adult life in what might be politely characterized as non-mainstream politics. For example, in 1924, at age 32, he's a passionate supporter of Fighting Bob La Follette's Independent Progressive Party campaign for the presidency on the foundation of ending American imperialism in Latin America and nationalizing key industries in the United States. In 1948, the year of his death, he was a passionate supporter of Henry Wallace's Independent Progressive Party campaign for the president. Wallace, some of you may remember, had broken with Truman over what he saw as Truman's hardline policy towards the Soviets. Wallace was very romantic about the Soviet Revolution, believed it as to be a great liberating event in human history. White goes on to do a PhD at Harvard, but can't get tenure there. He winds up in a small college in Appleton, Wisconsin. He's not happy there. He sends a letter to his former supervisor at Harvard saying that he decided to study Russian. He was going to get a scholarship to go to Moscow to study economic planning. But before he can go forward with his plan, he gets an invitation to go to Washington for a few months to work on a pretty low-level study of international monetary and banking institutions. And to make a very long story very short, he just makes himself indispensable there to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. But White also is involved in some freelancing, as it were, some diplomatic freelancing. To put it in context, 1933, a seminal event, the FDR administration recognizes diplomatically the Soviet Union. This was a major event. 1934, the Soviet Union joins the League of Nations. This is the background against which White gets enmeshed in a web of, shall we say, fellow travelers who are feeding information to the Soviet Union. The most famous spy he was involved with was Whittaker Chambers. He meets Whittaker Chambers in 1935. He feeds him classified information. He starts advocating for Soviet policy positions in administration debates. He places key people of interest to the Soviets in positions in the U.S. Government. There are lots of remarkable vignettes about how he influences policy in the Soviet interest. For example, in 1944, he was insistent that the U.S. give the currency plates for the occupation of Germany. The U.S. was going to produce occupation marks for Germany. He's insistent on giving these plates to the Soviets. The Soviets take the plates, print massive amounts of currency, cash it in Washington at the fixed exchange rate established by Harry Dexter White, rating the U.S. Treasury for, in current dollar terms, about $6 billion. At the time, in the mid-1940s, he was about as important to Soviet intelligence as Alger Hiss. But he's not nearly so well known today. And why is that? Well, I would characterize the Harry Dexter White spy case like a murder mystery where you have the witnesses, people like Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley. You have even more than that. There are Soviet wartime intelligence cables that are intercepted and decrypted by U.S. military intelligence. This is known as the Venona Project. It was only declassified in the late 1990s. I found 18 of these cables referencing White and his activities according to his various code names. You have the weapon, as it were, a handwritten memo of White's turned over by Whittaker Chambers in 1950. To Richard Nixon with classified information, but you don't have a clear motive. Well, in the course of my research, I found a long handwritten essay of White's in his archives that apparently nobody had seen before, in which he blasts Western, in particular U.S. hypocrisy towards the Soviet Union, extols the virtues of Soviet socialism, and concludes by paraphrasing the famous American radical journalist Lincoln Steffens, who after visiting Petrograd in 1919 said, "I have seen the future and it works." Harry Dexter White says, "Russia is the first instance of a socialist economy in action and it works!" Exclamation point. In terms of his legacy at Bretton Woods, this is the most interesting one, and then I'll end. In January of 1946, President Truman nominates Harry Dexter White to be the first U.S. executive director of the International Monetary Fund, a fund which White had created. He also intends to nominate him to be the first managing director of the fund, the head of the fund. But FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover gets wind of this and sends Truman a long memorandum saying, "Don't even think of it. I can prove that the man is a Soviet agent." Truman doesn't trust Hoover, but knows he has a huge political problem on his hands. he can't appoint another American to sit above Harry Dexter White because that would raise all sorts of questions about why the man was being passed over. So the Americans concoct a new narrative that they take to the British. We, the Americans, have decided, after all, that we don't want the IMF. We want the World Bank in order to secure confidence of the American financial community. This was nonsense. The World Bank was not an important institution to the United States in the 1940s. So the only reason why an American heads the World Bank today and a European heads the IMF is because of President Truman's efforts to cover up the White spy scandal. Truly a remarkable story that comes out of Bretton Woods. With that, I'll stop and open things up for questions. If you have a question, Brad tells me you should please approach the microphone so everybody can hear you and we can get it on the recording. Yeah.
Did you find any evidence that any possible prosecution of White was derailed, let's say, by Truman or other administrations?
Right. Harry Dexter White voluntarily gave evidence before the House Un-American Activities Committee in August of 1948 to defend himself against charges leveled by Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley. By all accounts, he put in a bravado performance. Peanut Gallery was actually applauding his sparring with the members of this delegation, the committee. But there was one member of the committee who was actually very sober and very narrowly focused, determined to get White on a perjury charge. This was 35-year-old Congressman Richard Nixon, who kept asking White, "Do you know Whittaker Chambers? Have you met Whittaker Chambers?" To which White continuously responded, "I do not recall." 2 days later, White dies of a heart attack. It's fascinating to speculate what might have happened had he lived. As we know, Alger Hiss was ultimately convicted only of perjury. White himself potentially could have been convicted of perjury. Another interesting historical counterfactual, Henry Wallace, had he implausibly become president, was going to make Harry Dexter White his Treasury Secretary.
So we can infer maybe if fate had not felled White, we would never have heard of Alger Hiss.
Whittaker Chambers, in his famous autobiography, Witness, emphasizes two characters, Harry Dexter White and Alger Hiss. So Alger Hiss was clearly quite important to Soviet intelligence. It's just that White was much more important than the public in the United States ever realized, and that's probably because of his untimely death.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, on this side?
Stereo. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember reading maybe 2 or 3 years ago that some documents had been found, I think transcripts or so, of Bretton Woods,
Yes, that's correct.
which had been forgotten.
Yeah.
Could you talk about those and how much help they were to you?
Yeah, I actually got access to them relatively late in my writing process. The editors of the transcripts were kind enough to share them with me. They didn't change fundamentally my view of how the event went, which had been based mainly on archival material from the IMF and particularly the so-called Morgenthau diaries. These were transcripts of all Morgenthau's private discussions. Bretton Woods was really an American kabuki play, scripted by White. Most of the activity went on privately in Henry Morgenthau's suite. He presided over the conference like a sort of godfather, and at 15-minute intervals, the heads of the various foreign delegations would come to his suite to plead their case for example, higher quotas in the IMF. Having said that, there was one episode that I was really struggling with, that I couldn't find the details of until I got the transcripts, which is actually quite important. So let me tell this little story. Harry Dexter White, as I told you, was determined to make the U.S. dollar the unrivaled global currency after the war. Keynes and the British, needless to say, refused to ratify anything of the sort. They had a big row about it 1 month before Bretton Woods at Atlantic City in a sort of dress rehearsal. So White decides, I'm not going to argue with Keynes anymore. I will take care of this at the conference. And this comes across in the transcript. White has in the draft IMF Articles of Agreement this phrase scattered throughout, gold convertible currency. At one point in the committee discussions, the Indian delegate gets fed up and says, it's high time that the Americans told us what is a gold convertible currency. Harry Dexter White, very excited, says, thank you very much. We will refer this to a technical committee. The technical committee is entirely comprised by his hand-picked American staff. They go through the entire document replacing gold convertible currency with US dollars. As Keynes and the other British delegation heads are being told to check out of the hotel and, by the way, sign the Articles of Agreement when you leave, Keynes did not have time to read it, and in fact complained bitterly about it after the event. He went back to White saying, we have to have changes. Of course, White wouldn't agree to any material changes. So there are some stories that do come out of the transcripts which are very valuable, but it doesn't change my view that this was fundamentally an American scripted event.
Before I get to a couple of comments and a question, let me offer a touristic or travel note for the benefit of members of the audience. I've been to the Mount Washington Hotel where the conference was held. I've been there a number of times, and I was there in 1994 when they had a splendid 50th anniversary retrospective on the conference. And if you haven't been there, it's a lovely part of New Hampshire. It's very pretty, and it's in the shadow or in the lee of the Mount Washington. So it's beautiful verandas. It's worth a visit. And there is the Gold Room, which is usually roped off, but that's where I think the documents were signed, and it's a good place to visit if you're up that way. Thank you, Ben. You've got some terrific insights and stories, and you've done a lot of excellent research. And it sounds like a very interesting book, which is certainly the most important thing I can say. But let me ask about two matters that I think are related. You seem to assign the devil's role to Harry Dexter White in making the U.S. dollar come out of Bretton Woods and out of World War II as the dominant currency. And while I don't have any reason to doubt your research about White and his intentions, I wonder whether you're giving him more credit than he really deserves, given the way the war was going and the necessity of United States intervention on the Western Front for the war to end the way it did. Similarly, I want to ask a particular question. In other words, so there's a question of context. Similarly, about his lending the plates for the occupation marks, lending or giving the plates to the Soviets. I hadn't heard that before. That's interesting. But again, did the president know about that? Did the secretary know about that? Wasn't this in the context of intense U.S.-Soviet friendship and cooperation and alliance? You make it sound a little bit, you make it sound subversive, and I wonder if it really should be seen that way. Thank you.
Sure. With regard to the first question, there's no doubt that if there had never been an international monetary fund, the United States dollar would still have been supreme after the war. Having said that, White made it such that there was no alternative for the world, that countries that wanted to participate in the IMF for the purpose of borrowing from the IMF would have to pay on their subscriptions overwhelmingly in gold or the only gold convertible currency, US dollars. So for the purposes of the IMF Articles of Agreement, the US dollar was the only legal surrogate for gold. So it made it supremely important. With regard to White's role with the occupation currency for post-war Germany, most of the players in this debate within the FDR administration, in fact all of them that I can find, were strongly against it. in particular the director of the Bureau of Engraving. There was an authority vacuum at the time. Morgenthau had no interest in technical issues like this, so he made White responsible for it. White's pleading his case and pretty much getting nowhere. But then he exploits a telegram sent by General Marshall from Europe, who's heard about this discussion. Marshall writes, if you decide to go forward with this plan to give the Soviets the occupation plates, please don't do it until after May 1st. May 1st, 1944. White completely mischaracterized.
45.
Sorry, it is in fact 44. Yeah, this is spring of 44.
Before D-Day.
Before D-Day. Yeah. He let me explain what he does. White mischaracterizes the memo from Marshall and tells his colleagues in the discussion that Marshall has, in fact, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have ordered that the plates be delivered to the Soviets. This is a complete mischaracterization of Marshall's memorandum. So White basically exploited this authority vacuum within the administration to turn the plates over to the Soviets.
What was magical about May 1st?
Marshall just viewed it as being essential to his planning of the military campaign that there not be occupation currency in the territories before a certain date.
I'm curious about Keynes. Two things. First of all, they say Keynes was very sick by this time.
Yes.
And he died shortly after. And I wonder if things would have been different if he had been feeling better. The other thing is, Keynes Keynes made his reputation on a very different explanation of the Depression. And what would if he had his druthers, it appears he was into this nationalist thing, sterling versus the dollar. But what was his vision for sort of the world going forward? And did we end up closer to that with the Marshall Plan? That's a lot of different things.
Keynes was indeed quite ill. He had a heart attack at Bretton Woods. He had another severe heart attack in November of 1945 when he was in Washington for 4 months negotiating the transitional loan with the United States, which went very badly. In fact, so badly for him, the new British Labour government in London was very angry at his performance. They felt that he had misled them about the prospects for getting a grant from the United States rather than a loan, and they sent somebody to replace him as head of the negotiating team. He died shortly after the Savannah meetings in March of 1946 to inaugurate the IMF and the World Bank. I think it's important to emphasize that White was very much a Keynesian in terms of his thinking about how the U.S. economy and the global economy should be managed, at least in terms of his public and official writings. There was no dispute between Keynes and White on some pretty fundamental issues. For example, we talked today about the Washington Consensus,
Right.
which emerged from the 1990s. And one key element of it was that, broadly speaking, capital flows across borders should be free.
Right.
Neither Keynes nor White believed anything of the sort, nothing of the sort. So what were some of the key differences between White and Keynes at Bretton Woods? The biggest one is that Keynes wanted to create this new international currency, which he called Bancor, which he hoped over time would supplant not just gold, but the U.S. Dollar, because he was concerned with the prospects for dollar diplomacy becoming ever more dangerous for Great Britain. He also wanted the IMF to be a very passive institution. He wanted it to be an extremely liberal lender that would really have very little power to impose conditionality on an ad hoc basis. White envisioned the IMF being far more powerful than Keynes. He wanted the staffing, for example, to be 10 times larger than Keynes did. The IMF we have today is much more similar to White's vision than it was to Keynes. Keynes viewed the IMF more as a mechanism than an institution.
Thank you. It sounds like a wonderful book. I'm looking forward to reading it.
A question on Keynes as a negotiator. He was not in the late 20s and early 30s as politically astute as Montague Norman, the head of the central bank, if you look at the Macmillan hearings and others. Based on that, and given the record and the quotes that you've had about how little esteem he was held in as a negotiator by his peers in Britain, was there any alternative leader of the delegation, like the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the head of the British central bank at that time?
That's a great question. I should emphasize that during the 20s and the 30s, Keynes played no lead international role. He basically took off the period between the wars. He was sent back to Washington in the early 1940s as sort of Britain's last-ditch financial ambassador. And that's because the British establishment had failed across the board. There's this beautiful piece of British doggerel from the period which really captures very nicely Britain's view of itself in the world. It says, "In Washington, Lord Halifax once whispered to Lord Keynes, 'It's true they have all the money bags, but we have all the brains.'" But Halifax failed. Halifax was the British ambassador, failed to loosen America's money strings. Lord Lothian failed to loosen America's money strings. So Britain was desperate. None of the British establishment was getting any significant financial aid from the United States. So they sent the man who was actually behind the scenes crafting policy. I mean, Keynes was brilliant as a ghost writer for those who were on the front line. Nobody understood the situation that Britain was in financially better than Keynes. So they knew that Keynes had one thing in Washington that nobody else had on the British side, and that was this celebrity status. People would listen to him. They were interested in what the great man had to say. So he did, in fact, have an opportunity to influence events, but in my view, he just played his cards very, very badly. He also dissembled with London. He was not winning his battles, but he would continually cable home and tell the House of Lords that everything was going swimmingly. The Americans, they're very legalistic. Lawyers are running everything. They can't write anything down. But I have an understanding with Harry Dexter White. Everything will be fine at Bretton Woods. And of course, it was nothing of the sort.
Just a quick small question for you. Lend-Lease was passed in 1941. Churchill was prime minister. One of the conditions you said was that the British give up the imperial preferences. But I always thought that Churchill said, "I'm fighting World War II not to give up the British Empire." Was he dissembling?
Correct.
Or
no, he had pretty significant fights with Roosevelt about so-called Article 7 of the Atlantic Charter, which became a fundamental term of Lend-Lease. He was particularly frustrated with Roosevelt because Roosevelt was so charming. He just refused to engage on the subject. When Churchill made a big fuss about it, Roosevelt, who didn't really see economics as a tool of geopolitical strategy, at one point, wrote back to Churchill that all was fine. I have no intention of using Lend-Lease as a tool for dismantling the British Empire. But his own people at the State Department were absolutely insistent beneath the surface that Article 7 shall stand. And indeed, it became a fundamental sticking point in late 1945 when the British negotiated the transitional loan from the United States after the war. Britain would indeed be obliged to eliminate imperial trade preference, but far more importantly, they would have to make the pound sterling fully convertible by July 15th, 1947. To explain to you why this was so critical, because it may seem very abstract, Britain had built up huge war debts, And not all these war debts were in the form of traditional borrowing. They paid their colonies and dominions for goods during the war with pound sterling that they refused to convert. So Britain's empire were holding this big stock of sterling, which they wanted to cash in for dollars so they could actually buy something useful. But London wouldn't allow them to. And the British didn't have nearly enough gold or dollar reserves in order to allow this to happen. So that's why that was so controversial.
So my impression is that when the IMF makes loans, that it has conditions which have had important economic and strategic consequences for the countries that accepted them. Was this part of White's plan? Was this built into the what happened at Bretton Woods?
Yes, White intended that the IMF should be a very interventionist institution. For example, countries would not be even allowed to devalue their currencies without obeying rules that were laid down by the IMF. Having said that, neither Keynes nor White ever envisioned that the IMF would be a crisis firefighter. Nothing of the sort. In both of their visions, the IMF was an institution that would operate basically in times of peace and financial stability, just greasing the wheels, as it were. If a country got into some balance of payments difficulties that were clearly short-term, the IMF would extend short-term credits. If there were, however, to be a quote-unquote fundamental disequilibrium, that was a technical term they used, then countries would have to take their own action in order to rectify the problem. The big one would be currency devaluation. Now, both Keynes and White were very much against our current system or non-system of floating exchange rates. Both of them supported a system of fixed but adjustable exchange rates. White wanted to make it difficult for countries to adjust. Keynes wanted to make it easier for countries to adjust. But the constant atmosphere of crisis that we've seen in the international financial and monetary system since the early 1970s was never something that White and Keynes envisioned the IMF being involved in. They were very much supposed to be an institution that would prevent war, prevent currency war, prevent wider war. But once the war actually broke out, it was supposed to be other institutions that would take over.
Which?
Again, the first line of defense was to be a change in national policy, in particular devaluing one's currency. But the IMF was never supposed to make loans to get countries through a crisis. If they were already in crisis, that meant that their policies were not correct and needed to be changed. Now, Keynes wanted to impose obligations on creditor countries. The United States in the 1940s was the world's largest creditor nation, and he blamed the United States for creating all these problems in the international monetary and financial system. In fact, the United States today, now that we are the world's largest international debtor, use the same language towards China that Britain used towards us in the 1940s. For example, in 2010, former Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner proposed that there should be caps on persistent current account surpluses. This was directed at China. This is pure Keynes. The Chinese, in turn, used the same language about the problems with the international monetary and financial system as we used in the 1940s. They say, as we did, that the problem lay with the debtors and their irresponsible fiscal and monetary policies. So where you stand depends on where you sit.
Thank you.
So, Ben, that segues really well into my question, and our hour's just about up, so we can make this the last one. Why can't then China and the U.S. make a deal,
Yeah.
like Britain and the U.S. did, Bretton Woods.
Bretton Woods is traditionally seen as this sort of kumbaya moment where the world came together in the service of international financial and monetary stability. In fact, the reason we got such a major agreement out of Bretton Woods is because one party held all the cards, the United States. And that's not the case today. Let me give you another example that will help illustrate this. In 1956, the Eisenhower administration was determined to push the British out of Suez. And to get them out, they threatened to provoke a sterling crisis by withholding IMF emergency aid. Now, the United States could afford to do this at no cost to itself because U.S. holdings of British securities were trivial, amounting to about $1 per U.S. resident. Chinese holdings of U.S. securities today amount to over $1,000 per Chinese resident. So if China were to provoke a dollar crisis in order to change American behavior, they would, at least in the short run, be hurting themselves as much as they would be hurting us. And that's why I explained in the epilogue of the book that I currently do not see any basis for a cooperative change in the international financial and monetary architecture. If there's going to be a fundamental change, I believe it's going to be a rupture, as it were, not a new Bretton Woods.
Great, thank you. Okay, once again, books are for sale at the cash registers, and if you'd like Ben to sign.